Wind River Valley, 1841. While his American neighbors rushed to throw up cabins using 8-inch pine logs and simple mud chinking, Norwegian immigrant Olaf Hogan was still building in late September. They called it wasteful. They called him a fool. He cut lodgepole pines measuring 14 to 16 inches across, requiring nearly twice the timber and 3 times the labor of standard construction. Every gap between the logs he packed with 3 separate layers, first moss, then rope fiber, then clay mortar reinforced with horsehair. Beneath the walls, he dug foundations 3 feet into the earth and built double stone walls filled with sawdust insulation. His neighbors completed their cabins in 4 weeks. Hogan took 11. Then January 1842 arrived. Temperatures plunged to 43 below zero, with winds reaching 30 miles per hour, the killing cold that tested every shelter in the valley. Standard cabins failed. Families burned through 3 cords of firewood and still woke to ice forming along interior walls. But Hogan's cabin held steady at 68, using only half the wood his neighbors required. 7 families abandoned their freezing homes and crowded into his warm shelter to survive. What did this Norwegian builder understand about heat storage and building physics that American frontier wisdom completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Wind River Valley stretched wide beneath the August sun of 1841. Golden grass broken only by dark stands of lodgepole pine, climbing toward distant peaks along Beaver Creek. The sound of axes echoed across the valley as settlers hurried to raise cabins before winter arrived. Most followed the same approach. They selected readily available pines 8 to 10 inches in diameter, cut quick notches, stacked walls rapidly, and stuffed the seams with moss and mud gathered in a day's work. Speed meant survival, and common belief held that any structure with 4 walls and a roof could see a family through a Wyoming winter. Olaf Hogan walked through the timber with different judgment. The 37-year-old Norwegian studied each tree with the careful eye of a man raised where poor construction meant death. Where others saw acceptable 8-inch logs, Hogan saw insufficient thermal mass. Where they considered 10-inch timber adequate, he searched for trees measuring 14 to 16 inches thick wood, dense enough to store heat for the long Arctic nights. His hands, hardened by work in Norway's Valdres region, where winters could fall to 50 below zero, seemed to measure thermal capacity by touch alone. He looked for slow-grown wood with tight grain that would absorb heat. During firing and release it gradually through the night, Jake Morrison watched Hogan's timber selection with growing disbelief. The Kentucky-born mountain man had survived 6 Wyoming winters using standard methods, and the Norwegian's approach struck him as unnecessary labor. That fool's cutting trees twice the size he needs, Morrison told anyone who would listen at the trading post. Waste of timber and twice the work. Morrison's own cabin, completed in 3 weeks, had served well enough in past winters. When temperatures dropped, he simply burned more wood and accepted frozen water buckets and frosted walls as part of frontier life. But Hogan's knowledge went deeper than practicality. In Norway, he had learned from master builders whose methods stretched back generations. They understood that thermal mass was essential. Each 16-inch log contained more than double the wood volume of Morrison's 10-inch timbers, forming what Norwegian builders called thermal batteries, massive wooden reservoirs, capable of storing warmth during active fires and releasing it steadily for 6 to 8 hours. The difference was mathematical. A 16-inch log provided over twice the cross-sectional wood area of a standard 10-inch log. That additional mass meant warmth could last through the night without constant fire tending. Mockery increased as Hogan's chinking work began, while neighbors stuffed moss between logs and smeared mud over the gapsa. process requiring only a few days, Hogan implemented a three-layer system that took weeks. First, he packed moss tightly into every seam. Next, he forced oakum, rope fiber, deep into the gaps. Finally, he applied clay mortar, reinforced with horsehair in thin layers, designed to flex with the wood instead of cracking during winter contraction. The Norwegian's still fussing with that cabin like he's building a church, Morrison remarked as September advanced. Winter'll catch him still working while the rest of us are warm. Settlement opinion hardened. Hogan, they said, did not understand frontier practicality. American building required speed and adequacy, not European perfectionism. Even his foundation drew criticism, while others set their first logs directly onto stones for the fastest progress. Hogan excavated 3 feet down and constructed a double-wall stone foundation. The cavity between inner and outer walls he filled with sawdust, creating an insulating barrier that prevented frozen ground from drawing heat out of the floor. The work required 2 weeks, instead of a single day. Waste of good stone, neighbors said. Grounds, just ground. But Hogan understood how heat traveled through solid materials. A standard stone base formed a thermal bridge, carrying warmth from the cabin into frozen earth. His insulated foundation blocked that pathway and preserved interior heat by late September. As snow dusted the peaks and frost appeared in the valley mornings, Hogan finally completed his cabin. His massive stone fireplace drew the last wave of criticism. Built with a hearth 3 feet deep and heavy stone shoulders extending into the room, it required far more masonry than standard designs. Fire's a fire, Morrison insisted. Burns the same whether the hearth's big or small. But Hogan understood that fireplaces could store heat as well as produce it. His deep hearth absorbed tens of thousands of British thermal units during evening fires and released warmth steadily for hours afterward. Morrison's thin-walled hearth heated quickly and cooled just as fast, forcing constant attention. When October brought the first true test, temperatures fell into the 20s and stayed there for days. Morrison's cabin revealed the weaknesses of conventional methods. Frost appeared along interior walls where warm air condensed against cold logs. Water buckets froze overnight, even when placed near the fire, as the logs shrank in the cold. Gaps widened and mud chinking cracked loose. Drafts pulled warm air outward while sucking cold air inside. Morrison rose twice each night to rebuild his fire, feeding pine into flames that roared fiercely but failed to warm the cabin evenly. Firewood consumption climbed from half a cord in September to a full cord in October. Temperatures swung wildly: 75 near the fireplace, 45 near the walls. Heat loss worked against every standard cabin. Nearly half escaped through the walls. Large amounts vanished through air leaks. More drained through uninsulated foundations and thin doors and windows. 3 miles upstream, Hogan's cabin performed with steady reliability. Interior temperatures held between 65 and 70 degrees, with fires built only morning and evening. The thick 14-inch logs stored heat and released it gradually. The horsehair-reinforced mortar held tight as the wood contracted. Most striking of all, Hogan burned only 7/10 of a cord through October, while neighbors used nearly twice as much for poorer results. Instead of recognizing superior building methods, the settlement clung to its assumptions. The Norwegian just got lucky wood. Morrison explained when questioned about the difference. Wait till real cold hits. Others said, convinced the performance could not last. The possibility that old-world knowledge might surpass frontier tradition challenged too many beliefs for the settlers to accept. At Fort Bridger, Sergeant William Holcomb recorded daily temperature readings that confirmed what old-timers sensed in their bones. This winter would test frontier construction beyond normal limits. His military thermometer showed December averaging 18 colder than the previous decade, with frequent Readings below zero and several days that never climbed above -10. Holcomb's meticulous row codes taken at dawn. Noon and sunset documented a weather pattern that would strain every heating system in the territory. The technical reasons for Hogan's superior performance became more apparent as November progressed. His thermal mass system operated on principles that frontier builders had never learned. Each 16-in log functioned as a wooden radiator, absorbing heat during active firing periods when interior air reached 75, then slowly releasing that stored energy as temperatures dropped. The massive logs heated slowly but cooled slowly, maintaining steady interior conditions for 6 to 8 hours after fires died to coals. Morrison's 8-tin logs heated quickly when flames roared, but lost their warmth within an hour of fire reduction, creating the temperature swings that forced constant fire tending. Air sealing proved equally crucial as exterior temperatures dropped. Hogan's 3-layer chinking system created an essentially airtight building envelope that prevented the convection loops, plaguing standard construction when warm interior air escaped through gaps in Morrison's chinking. It created negative pressure that sucked cold exterior air into the cabin through any available opening. This constant air exchange meant Morrison was essentially heating the outdoors with fresh cold air entering as fast as interior air could be warmed. Foundation thermal bridge compounded the problem. Morrison's logs rested directly on stone foundations that conducted ground cold into Thicabine structural wood. Even with roaring fires, the floor logs stayed cold, chilling the air near the cabin floor and creating uncomfortable drafts. Hogan's double-wall foundation with sawdust insulation prevented this heat loss, maintaining warm floor temperatures that contributed to overall interior comfort. By December's arrival, the performance gap between construction mids had become undeniable. Standard cabins required constant fire maintenance, consumed enormous quantities of firewood, and still failed to maintain comfortable living conditions. Families slept in shifts, to keep fires burning, wore coats indoors, and crowded into single rooms to concentrate what heat they could generate. Children developed persistent coughs from breathing cold, damp air, and adults suffered from the exhaustion of constant fuel gathering and fire tending. Hogan's family, meanwhile, lived in comfort that seemed almost luxurious by frontier standards. They slept in separate rooms, worked without heavy clothing inside their cabin, and maintained a regular schedule of twice-daily firing that provided consistent warmth. Visitors noticed the difference immediately. Stepping into Hogan's cabin felt like entering a differential zone, warm and dry and free from the drafts that plagued other frontiers. The weather station data from Fort Bridger painted an ominous picture as December progressed. Holcomb's readings showed sustained cold that broke territorial records with several periods, where temperatures remained below zero for 4 or 5 consecutive days. Old-timers who had survived decades of Wyoming winters began predicting what they called a killing winter, the kind of sustained cold that would test every aspect of frontier survival preparation. As 1841 drew to a close, the settlement faced a growing crisis. Firewood reserves that should have lasted until March were already half depleted. Families rationed fuel, letting fires die during midday hours and accepting interior temperatures that bordered on dangerous. Some began burning furniture and personal possessions to supplement their dwindling wood supplies, while others talked of abandoning their claim sand, retreating to Fort Bridger until spring. But the real test was yet to come. Holcomb's barometer readings and the behavior of wildlife suggested that January would bring cold beyond anything the territory had experienced in recorded history. The killing winter was about to arrive, and it would separate adequate preparation from survival-grade construction in the starkest possible terms. January 1842 arrived with a vengeance that caught even experienced frontiersmen unprepared. Sergeant Holcomb's dawn reading on the 5th throat as 35. the beginning of what would become 6 consecutive days of the most brutal, cold in territorial history. The sustained Arctic conditions created a crisis that exposed every weakness in standard frontier construction while validating the thermal principles Olaf Hogan had built into his cabin walls. Jake Morrison's family began each day by rebuilding. Fires that had died during the night despite banking with ashes and careful coal arrangement. The interior temperature of his cabin dropped to 40 by dawn, cold enough that their breath formed visible clouds and water left in cups froze solid. Morrison Burna threw 2 full cords in January's first 2 weeks, splitting and hauling wood. In conditions so severe they exposed skin froze in minutes, even with continuous firing that consumed logs as fast as he could feed them. Interior temperatures struggled to reach 50 during the warmest part of the day. The physics of extreme cold revealed the fundamental flaws in standard construction. Morrison's 18 logs, lacking sufficient thermal mass, heated quickly when flames roared, but lost their stored energy within an hour of reduced firing. His mud, chinking, already compromised by months of freeze-thaw cycles, failed completely as thalogs contracted in the unprecedented cold. Visible gaps appeared between timbers, creating pathways for Arctic air to flow directly into living spaces. The family hung wool blankets against interior walls in desperate attempts to create additional insulation. But the convection currents generated by air infiltration made effective heating impossible. 3 miles away, the Peterson family faced even worse conditions. Their tenants' wettish pine logs, selected for quick building rather than thermal performance, showed similar contraction problems, but with catastrophic results. The gaps between logs widened to nearly an inch in some places, allowing wind-driven snow to accumulate inside the cabin. By January's second week, the Peterson family had abandoned any pretense of heating separate rooms, crowding into a single space around their fireplace, while interior temperatures matched exterior readings in the rest of their home. At Williams Trading Post, 3 families who had given up on their individual cabins sought refuge around the large communal fireplace. Even this substantial heating source, fed by a seemingly endless supply of split pine, struggled against building's poor thermal performance. The Trading Post thin-walled construction and minimal chinking created the same air infiltration problems plaguing smaller cabins. Just on a larger scale, the families took shifts maintaining fires that consumed the post's entire winter wood reserve. In their desperate attempt to create a survivable environment, Hogan's cabin operated according to different physical principles entirely. His interior temperature dropped to its lowest reading of the winter, 58, but remained safely habitable even during the coldest nights. The massive 16-in logs released thermal energy at a predictable rate throughout the extreme conditions, dropping only 1 Ri per hour compared to 3 to 4 Ri hourly. Temperature loss in standard construction. His stone fireplace, banked with coals at 10 o'clock in the evening, continued radiating stored heat at dawn, having released approximately 6,000 British thermal units during the night hours when no active fire burned. The superior performance of thermal mass construction became measurable during this period of sustained cold. Hogan's logs contained 2.5 times more wood volume than Morrison's standard timbers, creating heat storage capacity that functioned like a thermal battery during extreme conditions. When evening fires heated the cabin's interior to 70, the massive logs absorbed that warmth and released it steadily over the following 8 hours. Morrison's thin logs heated quickly but cooled quickly, requiring constant fire maintenance that consumed both sleep and fuel reserves. Air sealing proved equally crucial as exterior temperatures remained below 0 for consecutive days. Hogan's horsehair reinforced clay mortar maintained its integrity despite the extreme wood contraction, creating an essentially airtight building. envelope his cabin lost less than 5% of interior heat through air infiltration, compared to the 25 to 40% heat loss plaguing standard construction. The convection currents that made Morrison's cabin impossible to hit effectively simply didn't exist in Hogan's carefully sealed structure. By January's third week, the crisis had reached life-threatening proportions throughout the settlement. Morrison's family faced carbon monoxide poisoning from their desperate attempts to increase heat output by restricting fireplace airflow. The Peterson family developed hypothermia symptoms despite being inside their shelter, their body temperatures dropping as interior conditions became indistinguishable from outdoor Arctic conditions. At Williams' trading post, smoke inhalation from burning green wood and furniture created respiratory problems among the refugee families. On January 28th, Morrison swallowed his pride and approached Hogan's cabin. "Can't figure how you're staying?" "Warm on half the wood," he admitted, his words forming ice crystals in the -20 air. Hogan invited Jim inside to examine the construction methods that Joku's methods that conventional frontier wisdom had dismissed as wasteful foolishness. Using heated stones as demonstration tools, Hogan explained the thermal mass principle that Norwegian builders had perfected over centuries of Arctic construction. The stones retained heat for hours after removal from the fire, illustrating how massive materials stored and released thermal energy at predictable rates. Hogan showed Morrison the three-layer chinking system that prevented air infiltration, explaining how each component contributed to the overall sealing strategy. He demonstrated the flexibility of horsehair-reinforced mortars, which contracted and expanded with the logs rather than cracking and falling out. Most importantly, he revealed the mathematics of thermal mass. Larger logs mean exponentially greater heat storage capacity. Morrison examines the 16-in-diameter logs with new understanding. Each timber represented a calculating vist in winter survival, requiring double the cutting labor but providing thermal performance that made theorbents between comfortable living and desperate survival. The additional 3 weeks Hogan had spent in construction now showed its return on investment. Reduced firewood consumption, stable interior temperatures, and elimination of the constant fire tending that exhausted other families. As January's final days brought temperatures to -41, the recorded territorial low, standard cabins throughout the valley became uninhabitable despite the enormous fuel consumption required to maintain even marginal heating. Families faced the stark choice between carbon monoxide poisoning from firing their heating systems or hypothermia from accepting interior conditions that matched the exterior Arctic environment. Meanwhile, Hogan's thermal mass construction maintained safe living conditions using a fraction of the wood that other families burned in their failing attempts to achieve psychobatability. January 31st brought conditions that tested the absolute limits of human shelter. Sergeant Holcomb's thermometer registered -43 at dawn with sustained winds of 30 miles per hour that created a wind chill factor capable of freezing Celsius in under 2 minutes. This combination of extreme temperature and wind velocity transformed the night Tinto, a proving ground where the difference between adequate construction and survival. Grade building Woodertermine, who lived and who died. Jake Morrison's family faced their crisis at midnight when the interior temperature of their cabin dropped to 32 degrees despite burning every piece of furniture they could spare for fuel. The combination of failed chinking and inadequate thermal mass meant their shelter could no longer maintain temperatures above freezing, even with continuous firing. Morrison made the desperate decision to evacuate, bundling his wife and 2 children in every blanket they owned for the 3 Malagrani through Arctic conditions to Hogan's cabin. The trek took nearly 2 hours as they fought through snowdrifts and wind that cut through their heaviest clothing like knives. At the Peterson homestead, the family's Swedish pine cabin suffered complete thermal failure as the sustained cold caused catastrophic wood contraction. Gaps between logs widened to allow wind-driven snow to accumulate inside their living space, creating interior conditions that match the exterior blizzard. By 3 o'clock in the morning, interior temperatures equaled exterior readings as their fireplace, fed with split furniture and personal possessions, proved incapable of heating a structure that had essentially become an outdoor shelter. The Peterson family abandoned their home before dawn, carrying only essential supplies through the howling wind toward the trading post. William's trading post faced its own crisis as the communal fireplace consumed wood at an unprecedented rate while failing to maintain survivable conditions. The 3 refugee families huddled around flames that devoured Thepist's entire remaining winter fuel reserve in a single night. Yet interior temperatures never rose above 40. The building's construction, adequate for normal frontier conditions, proved fatally inadequate when tested by Arctic extremes. Air infiltration through failed chinking created convection currents that made effective heating impossible, while thin walls provided another small mass to store and release heat during the critical hours when fires died low. Throughout the settlement, standard frontier construction revealed its fundamental limitations. Cabins built using conventional 8 to 10 inches logs lacked the thermal mass necessary to store heat during extreme conditions. Their mud chinking, compromised by months of freeze-thaw cycles, created air infiltration paths that made heating equivalent to warming the outdoors. Foundation systems that placed logs directly on stone-created thermal bridges that conducted precious heat into the frozen ground. These design flaws, barely noticeable during normal winter conditions, became life-threatening when temperatures dropped to unprecedented levels. Hogan's cabin operated as a thermal island in the Arctic conditions. Its interior temperature dropped to 55, the lowest reading of the entire winter, but remained well within survivable limits. The massive 16N logs continued their steady heat release at 1 degree per hour. Their thermal mass provided critical performance even under extreme stress. His 3FT deep stone hearth, banked with coals at 10 the previous evening, maintained surface temperatures of over 100 at dawn, radiating approximately 50,000 British thermal units of stored energy throughout the night. When Morrison's family arrived at midnight, followed by the Petersons before dawn, Hogan's 16 by 20 feet cabin demonstrated the true capacity of thermal mass construction. 23 people crowded into the space, men, women, and children, seeking refuge from conditions that had made their own shelters uninhabitable. Despite the overcrowding, the cabin's interior temperature rose to 68 with a single morning fire. Thermal MASS system proving capable of heating far more people than originally designed for without compromising performance. The physics of thermal storage became dramatically apparent during this crisis. Each of Hogan's 16N logs contained 201 of wood cross-section compared 279 square in Morrison's 10-in timbers. This difference in mass translated to exponentially greater heat storage capacity, approximately 3 times more thermal energy. STORED per linear foot of wall when multiplied across an entire cabin structure. This thermal mass advantage meant Hogan's walls functioned as a massive heat battery capable of sustaining comfortable temperatures for hours without active firing. The 3-layer chinking system proved equally crucial under extreme conditions. While standard mud chinking throughout the settlement failed catastrophically as logs contracted, Hogan's horsehair reinforced clay mortar maintained its seal integrity. The flexible mortar contracted and expanded with the wood movement, preventing air infiltration that made other cabins impossible to heat effectively. Wind pressure of 30 miles per hour, sufficient to drive a snow through gaps in standard chinking, found no entry points in Hogan's carefully sealed structure. Foundation thermal bridging, a concept unknown to most frontier builders, demonstrated its importance as ground temperatures dropped to unprecedented depth. Standard stone foundations conducted Heat from interior floor logs directly into the frozen earth, creating a constant drain on heating systems. Hogan's double-wall foundation with sawdust insulation prevented this heat loss, maintaining warm floor temperatures that contributed significantly to overall interior comfort. The insulation barrier, invisible but essential, prevented approximately 15% of potential heat loss that plagued every other structure in the settlement. As dawn broke on February 1st and temperatures began their slow climb toward -15, the community gathered in Hogan's cabin represented a complete reversal of social dynamics. The Norwegian immigrant, mocked 6 months earlier for his wasteful construction methods and excessive attention to thermal performance, had become the settlement's savior. His cabin provided the only reliably heated space in the valley, sheltering families whose own homes had proven inadequate when tested by conditions that exposed every flaw in conventional frontier building wisdom. The measurable results of the night told the complete story. Standard cabins had consumed 4 to 6 cords of wood in their desperate attempts to maintain survivable conditions, yet still failed to protect their occupants from hypothermia and carbon monoxide poisoning. Hogan used 1/3 C of fuel while maintaining safe, comfortable conditions for more than 3 times his cabin's intended occupancy. Construction time that had seemed excessive now showed its survival value. 11 weeks of careful building had created a thermal refuge capable of sustaining life when quick, adequate construction proved deadly. The crisis had transformed mockery into respectful recognition. But more importantly, it had demonstrated the life-or-death difference between building for normal conditions and building for the worst-case scenarios that inevitably arrived on the frontier. Winter, as Hogan knew from Norwegian experience, never negotiated with construction schedules or fuel budgets. It simply tested every structure to its absolute limits and separated survival-grade preparation from dangerous inadequacy. February brought not triumph, but quiet instruction as Olaf Hogan moved through Thra settlement, helping neighbors repair and rebuild their failed heating systems. There were no declarations of vindication, no reminders of previous mockery. Simply the practical work of transferring knowledge that meant the difference between survival and death in future winters. Jake Morrison, his pride tempered by nearly losing his family to hypothermia, became Hogan's most attentive student as the Norwegian demonstrated the 3-layer chinking system that had kept Arctic air from penetrating his cabin walls. Morrison watched Hogan mix horsehair-reinforced clay mortar, learning the precise ratios that created flexible ceiling compound capable of expanding and contracting with wood movement. The technique required patience foreign to frontier building practices, thin layers applied methodically, each allowed to partially cure before the next application. Hogan explained how the horsehair fibers distributed throughout the clay prevented cracking under thermal stress, maintaining seal integrity through temperature swings that shattered conventional mud chinking. Morrison documented the process in his journal, noting that proper mortar preparation took 3 days compared to the single afternoon he had previously devoted to chinking his entire cabin. The Peterson family received instruction in log selection criteria that challenged area they thought they understood about timber construction. Hogan demonstrated diameter calculation using a simple measuring technique, explaining how minimum 12-in logs provided adequate thermal mass for Wind River Valley conditions, while optimal 14 to 16 inches timber delivered the heat storage capacity essential for surviving extreme weather events. Lars Peterson handled the massive logs with new appreciation, understanding that each timber functioned as a thermal battery capable of storing and releasing heat for 6 to 8 hours after fires died to coals. At Williams Trading Post, Hogan addressed at a foundation thermal bridging with engineering principles that frontier builders had never encountered. He excavated a demonstration section beside the existing building, showing how standard stone foundations conducted drowned cold directly into structural wood through solid thermal bridges. His double wall technique created an insulation chamber filled with sawdust, preventing heat loss that typically accounted for 15 to 20% of total heating inefficiency. The additional labor required 2 weeks compared to conventional single-day foundation work, but the thermal performance gain justified every hour of extra construction time. Spring construction season of 1842 saw dramatic changes throughout the settlement as families applied Hogan's thermal mass principles to new cabin building. 7 families abandoned their existing structures entirely, starting fresh with construction. Standards that prioritize thermal performance over speed. Morrison's new cabin incorporated 12-in-diameter logs, a compromise between Hogan's 16-in ideal and conventional. 8-in practice while implementing the complete 3-layer chinking system that had proven essential for air sealing under extreme conditions. The Peterson family rebuilt using 14 lodgepole pines selected according to Hogan's thermal density criteria. Timber that required nearly double the cutting and hauling labor of their original construction but provided heat. Storage capacity essential for comfortable winter living. Their new foundation followed Hogan's insulated double wall design extending 3 feet underground with sawdust chambers that prevented ground thermal bridging. Construction time increased from 4 weeks to 8 weeks. But the thermal performance gains validated every additional hour of labor investment. Williams Trading Post implemented partial thermal mass upgrades, adding interior walls built with 12-in logs that created thermal mass zones around the main fireplace area. The retrofit approach provided measurable heating improvements without complete reconstruction, demonstrating how existing structures could incorporate Norwegian thermal principle through strategic modifications rather than total rebuilding. The improvements reduced the post-wood consumption by approximately 30%, while providing more consistent interior temperatures for winter operations. Community standards evolved rapidly as the winter's lessons transformed frontier building practices. Minimum log diameter requirements increased from 8-in to 12-in for all new construction. The 3-layer chinking system became mandatory, with specific material requirements for moss, oakum, and horsehair reinforced mortar application. Foundation insulation protocols required double wall construction with sawdust thermal breaks, preventing the ground heat loss that had plagued previous building efforts throughout the settlement. Winter 1842 through 43 provided measurable validation of thermal mass construction principles. Community firewood consumption dropped from an average 18 cords per family to 12 cords per family, representing a 33% reduction in fuel requirements while maintaining superior interior comfort. No families reported interior freezing conditions during a winter that included sustained periods below 0. Construction time increases from 4 weeks to 8 weeks, proved economically justified through single-season fuel savings that exceeded the additional labor investment. Fort Bridger weather records documented the thermal mass transition through systematic temperature and fuel consumption data maintained by Sergeant Holcomb. His reports to territorial authorities described construction innovations that achieved heating efficiency comparable to permanent military installations, while using only frontier materials and hand tools. The documentation provided official validation of Norwegian building principles that would influence a territorial construction standards for decades. The knowledge transfer extended beyond immediate neighbors through networks of communication that connected frontier settlements across the Rocky Mountain region. Norwegian and German mass were already familiar with thermal mass principles from European building traditions, embraced Hogan's adaptation of Old World techniques to American frontier conditions. His methods spread through ethnic community networks that carried technical knowledge from valley to valley, settlement to settlement, family to family. Oregon Trail travelers began stopping at Wind River Valley specifically to examine thermal mass construction techniques that promised reliable heating systems using minimal fuel consumption. Hogan's cabin became an unofficial demonstration site, where westward immigrants learned winter survival building methods before continuing toward their final destinations. The knowledge they carried helped establish thermal mass construction throughout the Pacific Northwest, where similar climate conditions made Norwegian building principles essential for comfortable frontier living. Military applications emerged as Army Corps of Engineers incorporated thermal mass concepts into fort construction manuals distributed throughout Western territories. Official recognition of Norwegian building principles provided institutional validation of TechniQuest frontier builders had initially dismissed as excessive. European perfectionism, military construction budgets, justified additional labor costs through documented fuel savings that reduced CD supply chain requirements for remote installations. By 1850, thermal mass construction had become standard practice throughout the Wind River Valley and surrounding regions, transforming frontier building from quick shelter creation to systematic thermal engineering. Hogan's influence seeks in through direct instruction, documented techniques, and the practical demonstration that Old World building wisdom properly adapted to New World conditions provided superior performance compared to conventional American frontier methods. His 6-tinen log cabin stood until 1923. Outlasting 3 generations of modern improvements while providing comfortable, fuel-efficient living for 81 years of Wyoming winters. The foundation stones, with their sawdust insulation chambers still intact, remain visible today near Dubois, Wyoming. A physical testament to the enduring value of building for the worst conditions rather than morale-adequate ones. Because winter always tests every structure to its absolute limits.